Okay, hi guys. I had a couple of requests on the previous video that I made for a tutorial on my color grading process. So I'm just going to really quickly run through what I did to my shots to get that kind of look. I'm not a professional colorist or anything like that, so this is just my techniques. But it's pretty straightforward, so hopefully it'll help some of you out. So the first thing to say is I'm working within the Davinci color management picture profile. So what you want to do to get here is just come up to your color science in your settings tab and make sure you're selected on Davinci YRGB color managed. By default, you're just going to have two options here, SDR and HDR. You want to uncheck this box and then select Davinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And then for your output color space, it's going to depend on what you're delivering for. You're probably going to be looking at Waqs 709. I'm going to use sRGB just because I work primarily for web output, and I find sRGB is a good bet for that. So once we've got that set up, we have an image here. This image was actually shot on in log, but because we're in the color managed workflow on Davinci Resolve, it is already changing that into a display accurate color space. But if we just bypass color management, you'll see that's the very flat log image that we would get straight out of the camera. But Resolve is doing this work for us already. We don't need to add a node to do that conversion. So this is a kind of standard starting point and the same kind of image you would get if you shot in Waqs 709 straight out of the camera. Now from here, the look that I was trying to go for is to some degree a film emulation look, and there's a film stock called Kodak 2383, which is a really commonly used film stock, and you'll find a lot of LUTs out there that are adapting your image to give you a more filmic look in that manner. Now, Resolve comes with a built-in LUT here. If you go into film looks, you can see you've got your Waqs 709 or DCI to 2383. You have a few variations here, but that's the LUT that comes with Resolve. Now that is not designed to work within Davinci Wide Gamut color managed workspace, so the results are not going to be great if you use that here. But luckily, there is a version of that has been adapted for Davinci Wide Gamut, and that's been done by Cullen Kelly, who's fantastic. He's got a great YouTube channel, website, highly recommend checking out his stuff. He's really knowledgeable about color grading and has far more information on this than I do. But you can download for free his 2383 LUT, and this is going to do a lot of the work for us. So we're going to start off just by dragging that onto this node. As you can see, it's brought in some contrast, giving us some more filmic look straight away. So we're going to take that as our endpoint and we'll work backwards from there. So I'm just going to add in some nodes before this. I'm going to add 4 nodes, and this is normally how I break down my color grades. So let's just line these up here. Now I'm going to call this one exposure, because often when you add LUTs, you're going to get a little bit of blowout in the highlights, a little bit too much contrast. I'm going to call this one our blur sharpen, because it really depends on the footage you get, whether you want to sharpen it up or soften it. Typically film has a softer look, but it depends on how sharp your lens is, whether you were perfectly in focus. So I usually leave this to the end and decide then. Now these two nodes are really what sort of sells the film look. We're going to use some halation, and here we're going to use a glow. And in fact, I'm going to add one more node after this, and we're going to add some grain as well. So I'm going to call this film grain. Okay, so we'll pop into our exposure here, and I'm just going to bring down our gain a little bit because the highlights are looking a bit blown out since we added the LUT. So just take it down to around there where we can see some detail. Now the shadows are looking a little bit dark. The nice thing about working in Wide Gamut is you can come over here to the HDR wheels, and this gives you much more control over your image because you have 6 color wheels as opposed to 3. So we're going to go into these 3 which look at the darker side of the image, and we'll just bring up our shadows a little bit here. You can see it's just bringing back some of that detail in the shadow, giving us a nice balance in the image there. And in fact, if we come to highlights, maybe we can just bring those down just a little bit as well. You can see that moving on the waveform there as well. Okay, so that's looking nice. I'll boost the saturation up to around 65, something around there. That's looking good, and just a tiny bit of mid details. The mid details just gives you that little bit of punch in the mid-range. It's kind of like contrast, but without affecting the whole image. I'll just leave that around 9 or 10 there. That's looking nice. So already we've got a really nice looking image here. This is what we had before, and this is what we've got now. So a lot of the work has just been done to that LUT and adjusting the exposure. Now if we come over to halation, we're just going to find halation here in our effects, drag that down onto the node, and I'm going to do the same for the glow. Put that here. Now the halation straight off the bat when you add it is a bit strong. You can see this in the image. It's really creating this halo around the highlights. It's a bit too obvious, so I want to bring this down to around a 0.1, somewhere around there. And if we zoom in and toggle this on and off, you can see now it's giving us just a much nicer subtle bloom around those highlights, which is a nice characteristic of film and something you don't tend to get in digital, so that just helps sell the film look. I'm pretty happy with that. I might just increase the spread just a tiny bit there, but otherwise we'll leave that as it is. Now we'll come over to the glow, and this is a really neat technique. I learned this from Waqs Qazi and his channel. I'll link that in the description along with Cullen Kelly's page as well. This is fantastic. He has so much good information as well, great tutorials. I learned a lot of the stuff that I know from him. And this really is a great technique for adding a nice roll-off and soft cinematic look to your image. So basically we just add the glow effect, we change this to soft light, and then we're going to bring the shine threshold all the way down to 0. Now at the moment it's slightly blown out the highlights. We're just going to come into the gain here, and we're just going to bring this down, but we want to play around to a point where we feel we've got enough brightness in the rest of the image, but not also getting that nice soft roll off from the highlights there. So it's maybe somewhere around there. And what you might want to do is just come back to your exposure, and we can just bring those highlights back a tiny bit again, because the glow does add brightness to the image. So you just have to balance between these two, get it to a point where you're happy. Just bring these down again, just a tiny bit. Something like that is looking nice. And if we toggle the glow on and off, you see it just brings this much more dynamic look into the image. And that's looking really nice. I'll just take it back a little bit with the global blend here. This is sort of like a total opacity for the whole effect. So let's just bring that back to around about there, just so we're not blowing up the highlights too much. And guys, that is about it. We'll just go over to the film grain as well. And let me search for that effect here. Film grain. And depending on the output resolution, if you're going HD, I'll often go with 16mm as it's a little bit more obvious. If we're doing 4K, probably go with 35mm setting. Now it's quite nice here. If you go grain only, you can get in here and you can see just the grain as it is, and that can help you just pick out, how you want the grain to look in your image, because not every part of the image is going to clearly show the grain. So I find this is just helpful when you're trying to design the look. Something around there take that off, close this down. So you can see this is really quite a simple node tree. We've got 4 main adjustments here, then we've just got our LUT and some film grain. Now the blower sharpen here, for this shot, I think we might add in just a tiny bit of sharpness, so I'll just take this to a 0.49. Anything below 0.5 is sharpening, anything above it is a blur. So 0.49 is nice, just brings us a little bit more sharpness into the image. And if we toggle before and after, you can see you've got this really nice cinematic image, nice soft highlights. And from here, you know, you're free to go and add in more creative color controls. You might want to adjust the white balance to get a warmer or cooler look, or do any of those creative things. But this is the base that I would work off to have that sort of cinematic look to the image. And I've just got one more clip here, you can see. Now that's our base image straight out of the camera. Now if we copy across using the middle mouse button here, those same color grading parameters. So let's put this here, but this image is a lot brighter straight out of the camera. So we're going to come back to our exposure, and this is common. You'll need to take those same nodes, but then just adjust your exposure settings between different clips in your timeline. So I'm going to come across to our color wheels here, and I'm just going to bring down the gain to a point where things are looking nice like that. And then I'll probably come across to our HDR wheels here, bring those shadows down a bit, get some more contrast in the image here. Something like that. Bring the highlights up a little bit here. And this is where the HDR wheels are really good. You just get a lot more fine control over your image. And maybe a little bit more in the mid details here, just to make things pop a little bit more. And again, we've gone from quite a flat, dull image to something much more interesting. Just boost the lights a little bit there. Bring the highlights down. Something like that, guys. I mean, you're free to play around with this. You know, you can spend as much or as little time as you want, really. But just in terms of taking it from a typical video-y looking image to something that's a lot more cinematic, this is really a great place to start. And we can go in and do more advanced things. You can add in power windows and mask out certain areas. But that is really the node tree and the process that I use as a first step to get a cinematic look to my images. So hopefully that was helpful.